Hi, everyone. This is Andrew,
And this is Laura.
and you're listening to Sunday School Dropouts. We are going to be talking about deconstruction, deconversion, and dechurched. This is another one of our touchstone episodes. For those of you who don't know, our touchstone episodes are foundational topics we will be discussing a couple times each year in order to make sure that people have access to foundational information that can support you on your path of healing from high control religion.
Yes, but before we talk about that, we are going to need to do some flannelgraph story time. So, Andrew, how about you start us off in our flannelgraph story time and let us know, what are you reading or listening to, or what's making an impact on you right now?
Yeah, I would love to start us off. I was going to say this always makes me think of like show and tell when I was like back in first or middle, like elementary school. And so it's like really cool. So I appreciate this little segment that we do. So right now, something that I'm reading is something that honestly I read a lot, but today happened to be one of the days I was rereading it. And that is some of the poetry of Mary Oliver. I don't know, those of you who are familiar with her, she's written so much that I've appreciated. I think the one poem that I appreciate more than any other that has been very meaningful for me in my own deconstruction, which I think is very appropriate given that's our topic for today, is her poem called The Journey. Since I've already brought that up, would you mind if I just read it?
I would love to.
Awesome.
Because I do like Mary Oliver as well, but I'm not like versed. I'm not versed in all of her poetry, but everything that I've heard, I really like. So I would love to hear it. Please share.
Yeah, I would love to share it. So this is The Journey by Mary Oliver. One day you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried. But you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late enough, and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. And that is The Journey.
That's so powerful.
And that's in fact the first thing I ever read by her before I knew who she was. And this is years ago. And it was at a time in my life where I did not know what deconstruction was. I had never heard the term. I was still in the frame of mind that I was just, a backslider in need of a coming to Jesus experience or something. I don't know. And I read that and it just resonated tremendously. So all of her work has been meaningful, but that one in particular has. And I honestly read that poem specifically. I probably read it once a week, honestly. Yeah. This particular book, Dreamwork, is the actual book that it comes out of. And I've probably read this over 100 times easily. So
poetry just has such a way that to communicate thought and emotion in a way that straight conversation or reading books or whatever can't. It's so interesting. I don't consider myself a poet in regard to writing. I know that's something that you're passionate about, but for my dissertation, I had a creative element that I got to do with it. And one night I was like, I think I should write poetry for each of these themes that I'm talking about, which is very bizarre because I've of course never done that before. But it was it just flowed so easily. And there is still a poem that I wrote, and it came to me literally in 5 minutes, and I wrote it all out. And I read it back and just started sobbing because it captured this experience in such a profound way. And every time I've read it since that point, I cannot hold it together because it taps into, for me, it's a poem about moving from feeling isolated because of trauma into healthy, safe relationships. And so for whatever reason, how it was written reminds me of the pain and the joy in a way that just talking like this hasn't. And so I've become very just poetry just has, it's really beautiful, and it does capture something that other things can't. So
yeah. No, it really does.
Mhm.
It really does. And yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's pretty cool. But I know that a lot of people coming out of religion in particular have found a lot of healing in, well, Mary Oliver for one, but other poetry as well. And I think that it's such a unique resource that we have.
Yeah. It is. And I love the arts in general, as you know. So, I mean, I am biased. I admit that, but I think poetry, just writing in general, creative writing, but there's just so much meaning and power that I think can be found there. I love it. So
that's so cool. Yeah.
Well, what about you? Flannelgraph.
Yeah.
What is Laura currently reading or listening to?
Well, so I do a lot of audiobooks. I used to really not like it, but now I love it because I can listen to them on like time and a half speed and while I'm cleaning or, doing whatever. So, I started listening to, I guess maybe it would be considered a classic, but maybe not like a classic by everybody. I started listening to the book 1984 by George. Is it George Orwell? Yeah, George Orwell.
Yeah.
Which, I know a lot of people actually coming out of high control religion have read, especially as they have like understood a little bit more about like the political climate and stuff like that. And there's a lot of podcasts that I listen to that kind of, will refer to things as like Orwellian. And so finally one day I was like, okay, I've got to just, read this. And I don't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't like a story that I was expecting. I thought it was maybe like a nonfiction book or whatever. And, but not reading like a story. And this one of course is, and it has been really, interesting. I had to go back and Google, like, when was this actually written? And I want to say it's like the 1940s is when it was actually written. Yeah. And of course it was set in 1984. And so it's been nothing short of shocking as I have listened to it, of like, wow, this was highly predictive of different kind of dynamics that we are seeing even today, a little bit terrifying. And yet like also important to understand. And I think there is like a there's a correlation between high control religion and what the book is talking about, just in regard to control, in regard to power, in regard to like, the first time the book said like thought police, I was like, oh, that is religion right there. And just kind of, it's been interesting because I know we talked about on a different, did we talk about it? I've done so many podcasts. I don't know if we actually talked about this. But there is such a thing, like there is such a dynamic within religion, that idea of like the thought police being God, the Holy Spirit, like whatever can, read your thoughts. And in this book, of course, it's not so much that they can like know what you're thinking, but they look at your facial expression or this or that to determine, kind of what's happening on the inside. And that hit me so closely, within high control religion, and how invasive and how violating that feels. Like to feel like I can't even have my own private thoughts, my private inner experiences, the way that I feel. And so anyways, I don't have like a bow to wrap that all up, but it's been an interesting kind of book to read. I feel like there's some catchphrases that we hear in culture that I'm like, oh, I didn't realize it was, kind of coming from this book. And it's just interesting. I don't know if have you read that book?
Yes, it's okay. Admittedly, it's been a little while, but I am familiar with it. And just familiar with the context in which it was written, because it was, I was a history major before counseling. And I did a lot of study and research on, political movements of the mid 20th century. So fascism, communism, authoritarianism.
Okay.
And, how propaganda and the controlling of media and just perception, public perception, and how important that is and how that's wielded. And 1984 was definitely a part of that. As far as things that I read, I mean, there's some really good books of that era too. Or maybe a few decades later, but are still very good. Like Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. It's different, but still good. That's another good one. Yeah.
It's so interesting, coming out of high control religion, or any system that is high control, like you can look back now with that perspective to see, kind of like the information control that was there, and really how isolated you become in terms of like, there's only certain resources that you can tap into. There's only certain, people that you could listen to, perhaps books that you can read. I know I've talked to different friends from like different high control religions, like I'm thinking of a friend with like within the Jehovah's Witness organization, where it's like they have their prescribed books and, teachers and audio things, and anything outside of that is considered either sinful or too progressive, or, not enough of what the message is. And I think so many of us are used to like having that information controlled and being told, here's where you can look for truth. And then anything outside of that is not truth. And so it is really crazy to like read books like this, where they latch onto these concepts in such overt ways, where you're like, this isn't even about religion necessarily, and yet that's everything I've experienced. So I don't know, I'm fascinated by it, and at the same time, I'm noticing myself like, it's heavy, like it's really heavy material. So I'm having to listen, for like 30, 60 minutes, and then I've got to put it down and go do something else, because it really, when things like hit close to home, it can be really, you just have to be careful with how much you consume,
Yeah, absolutely. No, that absolutely makes sense. And you said you don't really have a bow to wrap this up with, and I suppose I don't either, but I do think there's so many parallels with just the way authoritarianism works. And then you look at high control religion, and it's like, holy shit, that's actually pretty similar. A lot of the tactics are pretty similar, if not identical, at least in the way they function to bring about conformity,
Yeah. And it really, I know for people who live in the United States, especially if you're coming out of, high control religion, like you can then really see the marriage between high control religion and where certain political parties or messages or whatnot are at. I know I listen to a lot of to a podcast that focuses on like white Christian nationalism. And so you see kind of the marriage of like this authoritarianism messaging with like fundamentalist messaging. And it's just not a far stretch, right? Like, of course they would go together. And I think that can be fascinating and also terrifying.
Yeah, no, it definitely can be.
All right, everybody, it is time for our prayer request, which for those of you who are not familiar with evangelical language, prayer request is a fancy way to talk about gossip and all the things that are going on under the banner of, really having a heart for other people and wanting the best for them according to God. So this is our prayer request segment where we are, talking about what's on our heart. So Andrew, I'm curious to know, I know you have a topic that you thought of. Share with us what's on your heart today.
Yeah. So some of you may be aware of this happening recently. There's been a lot of chit chat in social media about Jonah Hill and some text messages that he sent to, I don't know if they're still together, current girlfriend or recent ex. I don't know. At any rate, but that. A lot of folks probably know what I'm talking about, but and also I just think that the idea of men, it doesn't have to be men, but it's usually men, co-opting language around therapy and trauma-informed stuff and consent and things like that, co-opting it and still finding ways to kind of be coercive and abusive and just gross. That's something that I think that's worth talking about. It's definitely something that I've seen from time to time, like in the deconstruction space too, not trying to crap on anybody, but just, I think people do start going to therapy, start doing good things, and sometimes are still able to kind of co-opt the language, but still be causing a lot of harm. So I think that topic in general is something that's really worth talking about and addressing.
Yeah. I've stayed loosely connected to the Jonah Hill stuff only because I was just really busy. And, when all of it was coming out, I kind of, kept tabs. I always like to keep an open mind in the sense that, these are selective messages that we're seeing, parts of conversations, we don't know context. But as more and more came out, I think there was kind of one screenshot that was being shared, that a lot of people kind of latched onto. And then slowly there was a whole kind of series of conversations that did give a bit more context, which I think is important because, the one thing I think is important to note is that, when we are first starting therapy or even, starting to talk about new things in therapy, we don't always do a great job communicating it. I read kind of what he called his quote unquote boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, wow, that sounds a lot like how myself or how other people in my life communicated boundaries when I was first learning about them. These rules of what I need you to do in order to make me feel safe. And I think that's where the co-opting part comes, but also the immaturity part can come, of like, here, I'm going to say that this is a boundary. I'm going to use therapy speak to get you to do what it is that I think that you should do. I'm going to call it this thing, in this case, a boundary. And I'm using that to try to regulate my nervous system. And I think as we heal and as we grow, we start to go, oh, yeah, it's not other people's responsibility to, do these things for me. And so I actually went back and I looked to see, because I was like, okay, he just had that documentary come out on Netflix called Stutz, which I haven't watched. It's on my list. But I was like, okay, so when did he start working with this guy as compared to when did these text messages come out? Right. And it was about 3 years after. So I was like, all right, at this point, we should be knowing a little bit about appropriateness of like what boundaries are, and that they're not meant to control people. And yet I see that happening, like you said, a lot. I think boundaries is a very kind of easy one to hone in on because we see that a lot in post-religious spaces, in social media, where it's like, yeah, I'm going to tell you this is a boundary of mine. And that kind of shuts down the conversation. If you've said it's a boundary, then I can't challenge that, or I'm considered to be disrespecting your boundary, even if it's not a boundary, even if it's an ultimatum. Like Jonah Hill was giving a set of rules, and I don't know their relationship. Perhaps they had an agreement beforehand that said, here, I'm going to not do this or that or whatever. I don't know that. Okay, so I don't want to comment on that piece of it. But as it was communicated just in what we saw, those are a list of rules of things that could potentially be used to control somebody. But when they're laced under that umbrella of boundaries, it becomes very hard to have a conversation about that.
Yeah, there's definitely not a conversation that would be had. It was just that you do this or you're not respecting me is what's being implied.
Yeah.
Another way I see that communicated sometimes, another I hate to call it a buzzword because it's so important. It's not, I don't mean that flippantly, but the word consent. Someone might say that I did not consent to you doing XYZ, which is like, feels really gross to be on the receiving end of that. Like I'm violating your consent when perhaps what you're actually doing is manipulating what I can and can't do. You're violating my autonomy, but saying I'm violating your consent. And I've seen that one pop up a few times, not with Jonah, but just in general. In general, I kind of in the boundaries conversation, I've seen that consent word misapplied a few times.
I had a very good friend say that to me. This was a while back, where they were at a different point in their own healing process. And it was to the point where even though I was one of their very, very good friends, I had to ask permission every time I wanted to share something about myself or if I could give feedback, which I understand the importance of, not just like giving unsolicited advice, but it was, when we get to certain points in relationships, it's like, we know each other enough to say like, oh yeah, I'm going to just kind of share a little bit about my life or whatever. And I had made a comment someday and at one point I had asked permission to share something and they didn't like what I said. And they said, well, I don't consent to receiving that feedback from you. I don't consent to you being able to talk about that with me. And I was like, it caught me off guard because I was like, that feels like I've just violated you now. And that A, was not my intent at all, but B, that was that. I don't think that's how that word is supposed to be used necessarily, or maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying too. I'm not sure, but that idea of like, I'm going to use that as a way to push back on something that makes me feel uncomfortable or that I don't want to hear, and then turn it around and tell you that, you did something wrong by saying that, or, offering feedback that I quote unquote did not consent to.
Yeah, no, I think we're on the same page. Yeah. I think the issue I see with any of this is when when we're using it in such a way where it shuts down the conversation.
Yes.
And does not allow, because the thing is, if you're, I mean, and perhaps you're in a space where you don't have the bandwidth to have some difficult conversations in that moment, and that's valid. That's okay. And also, if you're using this type of language to just shut someone down, control their behavior, and you're never actually tending to your stuff that's coming up.
Yeah.
You know, I would be curious about that. I'll say it that way. As I say it by therapy speak, I'd be curious about that. Like, what's going on there? Because it sounds kind of sounds like there's probably, like, in taking this back to Jonah Hill, there's some insecurities that you have. It's okay that you have insecurities, but acknowledge it for what it is. Like, those are your insecurities, and what you're doing is you're using therapy speak to try to control and coerce somebody else's behavior. All the while, you aren't necessarily addressing what's actually happening within yourself. And maybe he is in therapy. I don't know, but that would be my concern. That would be the potential red flag that I would see there.
Yeah. And I've seen, even in like post-religious or deconstruction spaces, where the language, various therapeutic terms, consent is one of them, is used as a way to truly manipulate people into relationships that they think they're consenting to, but then find out that there's something else going on behind the scenes, whether that person is doing this to multiple people, or, that they're engaging in inappropriate behavior. They're not telling the truth fully. They're giving partial information. I've seen that happen time and time again. Unfortunately, it's been mostly dominated by men in terms of like being the perpetrators of that type of behavior, where they've used different trauma language to kind of endear themselves to women in a lot of cases. And it is in such a way where they are creating a narrative that gets people to do what they want. And then when they're found out, it can turn really ugly. It doesn't, they're not taking ownership, and they're saying, well, you consented to this. I had your permission, or you said you were in agreement with this, but it wasn't, it had they been given all the information, had they not been, love bombed, had they not been, pulled into this relationship in an honest way, they would not have consented.
Yes, I suspect, but I don't know for sure what you're referring to. I suspect, and I've seen this with like ethical non-monogamy. I'll just say it the way that comes up a lot, has come up a lot. I think it can be an awesome thing and a very healthy thing. And I've also seen what you just described there. Unfortunately, some men really definitely taking the ethical out of it. Unfortunately, the way it's handled sometimes.
Yeah. Well, to be clear, I do have specific examples, multiple examples in mind. But I'm not, that comment was not made in regard to just one. It was kind of an overarching dynamic. I don't know if the Lord has laid on my heart to spill all the tea.
Totally fair. Well, and to be fair too, I think that speaking in generalities, not that specifics aren't important, but I think the thing is, this is a wide ranging topic that affects many different dynamics. And so, I think it's important, like even with Jonah Hill, like I came into this, like, I'm not trying to just dump on Jonah Hill. He's a good case study, but it's not about Jonah Hill. There's this behavior that happens. There's this dynamic that happens, and it happens in a lot of spaces, in a lot of contexts. And I think it's important to just recognize that, I don't think we have to get sidetracked with specific examples necessarily to be able to recognize these dynamics and what abuse can look like.
Yeah, because I also think that there's many people in the aftermath of those text messages coming out. There is dialogue that has been happening in multiple different categories and topics of, just people feeling like, oh yeah, like I've been on the receiving end of messages like that, or of somebody saying, these are my boundaries, when really they're rules, and they've felt like they've been able to put some language or context around their own experiences. And so, I can't say that makes Jonah Hill an evil, abusive person. Like there's a lot of context that I'm missing that I don't know about their relationship. I have no idea, other than these this brief snapshot, right, into what their relationship was. It doesn't sound particularly wonderful. Like it doesn't sound like it was filled with healthy communication. We'll say that much, right? But I think that when we do have instances like this, it does give a lot of people some places to go like, oh, this helps me better understand what it was that I went through, or maybe even what I've done to other people, as I've tried to, navigate relationships post trauma, and figuring all of that out. And I think it's important then to be able to have these conversations. I'd be curious to know, because I said at the very beginning, that when I read just the first screenshot, I think that was what that was kind of circulating at first. And it was kind of this list of like, here is what you can do. Here is what you cannot do. Right. And it's kind of like, whoa. And yet I know that I've done that and have been on the receiving end of things like that, and when I think back to like times where I've done that, here's what you can do, here's what you cannot do in order to be in relationship with me. And it sounded very controlling. I know my intention, and I'm just speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for Jonah Hill or anybody else. I know that my intention was to try to use other people's behaviors to help me feel calmer, to help me feel safer and more regulated. And I think it's worth noting especially because we're talking about trauma, like as this podcast, that like that often happens, but that is not the end. That's not the end of where we stop with boundaries. Like the hope is that as you grow and resolve trauma and recover, that your boundaries would become more flexible, where you'd say, here's what I need in order. This is what brings me safety. Let's talk about this. Let's have a conversation. I think that's what was missing in that exchange, is like the conversation, the compromise, the relational aspect of it. Now, I don't know if they've had that conversation before, or, again, I don't have the context, but I think as we resolve trauma, that's what happens. Our boundaries become less rigid and they could become more flexible. They're able to consider other people's experiences and needs and the other human that we're relating to in order to create boundaries that feel safe for multiple people. But that's just something I've been thinking about in that realm. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, no, I very much agree with that. I think that the more you grow, the more that was what was missing, was the conversational, relational aspect. Because like you said earlier, it was an ultimatum. Yeah. And like there was no room for discussion. It was just kind of this is it. It's not open for discussion. It's not open for curiosity or understanding or anything like that. And I do think it's important to know what you need to feel safe, and recognizing that, but then being able to also talk about that rather than, again, just making a list of demands, Yeah.
I'm putting you on the spot and I'm happy to chime in here too. But like, if you were to offer a different way of communicating something like that, how would it sound? Like, how would it be different? How would we have an actual conversation versus a list of demands that really seek to control somebody else's behaviors?
I mean, I think the first place, rather than saying that I need you to do this thing for me, or anything of that sort of language, it's still important to express what you're feeling. And if you don't feel good about something, that's valid. But rather I would express it with like kind of like that I-centered language of like, this particular thing is bringing this stuff up for me and I'm feeling this way about it. Being careful to say it in such a way though, where I'm not telling you what you have to do. I'm not telling you that you're doing anything wrong or trying to make me feel a certain way. You're living your life, but this is something that's coming up for me. It's just one of those things that we're in the interest of communication and being transparent about what you're feeling, what's coming up. Yeah. I feel like if somebody's making a list of demands, it's coming from a place of insecurity, and we all have insecurity. That's okay. But recognizing that for what it is, and then just trying to lean into that and be curious, be honest. I think that will take you to much healthier outcomes than a list of demands. Yeah.
I very much agree. Yeah. When we can open it up for discussion, like I'm thinking about one of the statements he made is, you with these certain people who are maybe like more immature or irresponsible, which he's defining it as immature, irresponsible, right?
Right.
So with these people that I'm determining are irresponsible or immature, you can do these things. You can go out for coffee or lunch, but not really have deep conversation or anything more than that. And when I look at that, I'm like, okay, so what you're saying there is, hey, I noticed that when you spend time with these people, you come home and gosh, you're really discouraged, or you're really ashamed of yourself, or you feel guilty, or you start yelling at me, or there's, division in our relationship or whatever. I'm wondering, can we talk about what it would be like to notice that in those relationships and how we can make sure that those people's lives don't impact our relationships in this way, right? Mm-hmm. That's like a dialogue. That's an actual conversation. I'm not saying you can't spend time with these people. I'm just noticing that you spending time with these people is impacting us negatively. So how can we navigate that together? Right? Because I want you to have your friends. And if these are the people that you enjoy spending time with, I want you to be able to do that. I just don't want it to divide our relationship. Mm-hmm. Of course, I know I'm making a lot of assumptions about like what their relationship is. Like, I don't know those details, but I'm just thinking, and, that would be a different way to have that conversation. Mm-hmm. You're validating all parts of it.
Right. Well, it's a way of having the conversation because you're actually having a conversation.
Right.
True.
Like, that's true.
I think that's the biggest piece. It's like, there's not really like a cut and dried right way to go about this, but it's conversations. Like, it's a two-way street. Yeah. Like, if this is a relationship, I one thing I've said about boundaries to some folks I work with is the idea that being basically like, how close can I be to you while still keeping myself safe? Like, the goal is not to build a wall. The goal is not to burn a bridge. The goal is relationship. If I don't want a relationship with you, I'm not even going to be considering boundaries at all, because why would I? You're not even relevant in my life. So if I'm even thinking in terms of boundaries, it's because I want relationship. Like, there's already that underlying assumption. And so, anyway, all of that to say, like, actually having these conversations, being able to talk about these things. And if it's hard and you find that you're not able to really have these conversations, I would be curious about that. Just notice what is showing up, what's keeping you from having these conversations. Like, what do you notice physically? Like, what, because something's happening, and I would just really be curious about that.
Yeah. And I think when we notice that I have to put up a boundary in order to control somebody else's behavior so that I feel okay, that usually is that's the exact space where we can be curious, right? Mm-hmm. What is it about that thing? Now, there are ways where you go, hey, this person is doing X, Y, and Z. I've communicated to them. Mm-hmm. We've had conversations, we've had agreements, they're being broken, where you have to say like, hey, I am perpetually feeling unsafe, or this is against my values or whatever. And if they want to continue doing that, that's fine. That's their choice. Mm-hmm. I'm going to give them their choice. And I also get to make choices where I say, maybe this is not the relationship for me to be in, whether that's a romantic relationship, friendship, working relationship, anything like that. It is okay to make choices in relationships. Those aren't ultimatums. An ultimatum is saying, I need you to do this in order for me to be okay. And if you don't, the relationship is done. So there's like that threat of disconnection. That's very different than saying, hey, here's the pattern that's been in our relationship. I've communicated this. I would love if we could, shift this dynamic. But if that's not something you're interested in, I will accept that. And then I also am accepting that I get to make choices as a result of that. And so I think that's also important to recognize that we do need to look at where any controlling behavior, anytime that we're trying to control other behaviors, is the space where we can get curious. And that also might let us or clue us into where we need to DTR, define the relationship. Or redefine the relationship.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely.
Yeah. Bless Jonah Hill, huh?
Yeah. He brought up some good conversation. Yeah, he did. Well, and I think it's also for me, and just the juxtaposition of the Stutz documentary that he put out a few months ago or a year ago. I don't remember when it was now. Really talking about therapy. And I think that's great. I still find that helpful. I think normalizing the conversation around therapy, especially for men, is very helpful. But, then just that. And now I see these text messages, and I know everybody's a work in progress. I get that. but that really is what struck me. Like, oh man, this is really something worth talking about.
I think so too. Well, we will keep him on our hearts, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Anything else that you feel like sharing today?
I think that's about it for today.
Okay. Well, I feel like I've been able to share what's on my heart as well. So with that, we will say amen to our prayer time.
Amen. So we're going to be talking a lot about terms and, definitions of things, but deconstruction.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's not the only term. I know that's the kind of the big term that a lot of us know about and have heard of over the last few years, but also deconversion, dechurched. These are all terms that I think we hear it a lot, especially those of us who are in those social media spaces. And we've probably all witnessed at least one spicy little debate about what actually is deconstruction and what it looks like and whatever, all of those things. I am curious, Laura, when did you first become aware of the term? Actually, that would be, I think, an interesting place to start because it is kind of a buzzword. It's not a new term, but in terms of being a buzzword, I feel like it's recent.
Yeah, I think I had probably heard the term in other contexts. I mean, decades ago at this point, but as it pertains to religion, honestly, it probably was around maybe the 2016 election. I feel like that is the point where we started to see on social media a much larger conversation of, people coming out of formal religion. There was a lot of disillusionment that was happening. And as a result, there was conversations that were starting on social media that were just people were talking about their experiences and starting to develop language around it. So probably 2016, 2017 was when I first heard the words like deconversion and deconstruction. And it was confusing though to me at first. Like there was a lot of intertwining of like deconstruction and deconversion. Like I would find people and myself using them interchangeably. And I couldn't really figure out deconstruction, especially. I was like, I don't totally know what that is. Is that religious, like healing from religious trauma? Like, is that important? I don't know. It was very confusing. There wasn't a lot of language around it. Now knowing like kind of what deconstruction is, when I started that process kind of formally, I didn't have language like that. And so, I think it was probably, I guess now close 7-8 years ago. What about you?
Yeah. So the actual term deconstruction, I only heard of, I think it was, let's see, I can't almost place it specifically. I'm trying, what year is it? What year is it now?
I know it's 2023. Yes.
It was 3 years ago. And I placed it because that was quite a tumultuous year, literally, but also figuratively in my own life. That was COVID. That was the year George Floyd. That was so many things like happened simultaneously that year. And the first person that I heard the phrase from, now he didn't coin it by any means, but John Steingard, formerly of Hawk Nelson. He used to be a lot
friend
more,
of mine.
Oh, nice. Yeah. He used to be a lot more active on Instagram, not as much now, but he was someone who really was influential for me, putting language to what I had already been going through for probably 6 to 10 years. And so it's one of those things where it was an interesting experience for me. I feel like I had already deconstructed, didn't know what the hell that was. So I did it alone years ago, did a lot of work. And then I'm stumbling upon this community and this term. And I'm like, oh shit, this resonates. But so the context is, I think it might have been on Facebook, but it was linked back to Instagram. And it was a headline from something. And it basically said, Christian rocker says he no longer believes in God or something, something controversial like that. And I'm like, I'm curious who this is because, high school years, Christian rock was all I listened to. So I can guarantee you, I know who this is. Oh, sure enough, I know exactly who this is. I didn't, And so, that just kind of that's actually what opened the door for me finding the whole community online and then just learning about that term. But then I also found out that a lot of folks disagree on what that means, what it looks like.
Yes.
On the Christian side, those who are still very committed to the church, whatever that church may be for them. I know a lot of them were conflating it with deconversion, with leaving the church, with becoming an atheist or agnostic or whatever. And there was a lot of confusion early on as to what in the world does deconstruction mean? Because everybody has their own definition and it depends who I ask.
Yeah. Do you have like a working definition that you give for deconstruction? Like when people ask you, what is it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do. I think this probably runs most closely with a definition that you might hear from Phil Drysdale, if any of you follow him.
Yeah.
Basically, it's to put it as succinctly as I can without getting too wordy, you're questioning your long-held beliefs. Mm-hmm. The old answers to those questions that you were given, whatever those may have been, are no longer good enough. Mm-hmm. And lastly, and this part is the part that I would say is most pivotal to making it deconstruction as opposed to just something else. That is, whatever your newfound beliefs are, but from that point moving forward, you are holding them with more lightness, more flexibility, more openness to and curiosity. Mm-hmm. It's not to say that you can't have an opinion. Of course, you can have an opinion on anything, but just the openness to being wrong, the openness to not knowing, the uncertainty, and learning to sit with that uncertainty, even if it is uncomfortable, because it will be. But being able to sit with that. So those are kind of the 3 points that I typically will lay out. And to be clear, you can. I think you can deconstruct without necessarily deconverting or leaving church. Yeah. But on the flip side, you can also do those other 2 things without deconstructing. But what about you? I feel like I'm about to go off on another tangent. Yeah. I don't want to do that. How do you define it, Yeah.
I agree with what you're talking about. I appreciate how Phil Drysdale has also talked about it as well. I tend to define it more as like a concept than like a specific, and I think that's maybe why it's hard to be like, what is the concrete definition? Like, the word that comes to mind when I think of deconstruction is untangling. Like that's, sometimes I'll use that word interchangeably, kind of like untangling what it is that I've learned, how that's impacted me, and asking those hard questions. Do I believe this anymore? Does this work for me anymore? Does this, promote my values, authenticity, things like that, the things that are important to me? And like you, I think there is that component of going, deconstruction. Well, personally, I think it should be something along the lines of like working towards like a looser grip on things. But I also know that it doesn't necessarily mean that for all people, like untangling my beliefs so that I can dive into other beliefs. Mm-hmm. I'm like holding myself back to like, talking too far ahead. I know where we're going to kind of hopefully get in this episode, but yeah, I've always kind of the way I describe it in my book is like a burrito bowl, like a deconstructed burrito bowl, right? Where you like take the component parts of it apart. And so instead of having it in a burrito, it's like you have a bowl and you get to decide what you want to put in rather than it being all mashed up together. And so I sometimes describe it that way. That can sometimes be easier to understand. I tend to be a person, and you might agree with this, especially given your Instagram handle, of going like, I think this is a bit of a lifelong process. Not that you have to be in it, like, in the thick of it all the time. But when we talk about deconstruction coupled with the idea of like holding loosely to things, that to me feels lifelong, of going, I'm not going to like untangle these fundamentalist beliefs, have a new set of belief systems, and then hold on to them so tightly that they can't be challenged or they can't be, like other things can't slide in there, new ideas, new concepts, those sorts of things. So I think part of it really is like this lifelong process of saying, I'm open, I'm holding things with an open hand where I might be wrong. And honestly, giving myself permission to consider that if I don't believe in 5 years what I believe today, perhaps that's okay. And that's actually just considered growth, that I'm not holding so tightly to my beliefs that I can't move anywhere, but that they would transform as I grow. I don't even know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think as even you were describing that, I've also, the metaphor came to my mind of deconstruction really not being like a linear process at all. It's almost just more of a lens through which you just view and interact with the world. It's kind of just an ongoing, ever-present thing. So it's not something that you're ever going to like, oh, I'm done now. Now, what you're focusing on absolutely will shift. like maybe there comes a time when, like for me,
Yeah.
like I don't really worry. I'm not really focused on Christian theology anymore. I'm not focused on Adventism anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that I'm done deconstructing. It's just those aren't things that are really taking up my bandwidth anymore. I feel like I've really kind of sat with those and approached those and unpacked those and all of that. Now I'm kind of onto other things. I'm applying the deconstructive lens to these other things, certainly. But what it looks like has changed, even though I would say, I think it's fair to say that it's still a process that I'm still engaged in. It's just how I'm showing up in life in general.
Yeah, I love that. How would you say, is that similar or different than deconversion?
Yeah. So, and this is, I think, a very good question, simply because so many folks conflate the two, I think. So yeah, they can overlap, but they're not inherently the same, is the way I would say it. They absolutely can happen together, and often they do, but they're not inherently the same. Deconstruction is just, again, what we've kind of talked about, just the way of holding ideas and approaching them and viewing things. Deconversion specifically, I would describe it as basically a departure from a faith group. And when I say departure, and like from an intellectual cognitive perspective, because I suppose you physically might still be in it.
Sure.
In many cases, that is how that works. You intellectually leave before you physically leave in many cases. And I think you can deconvert without deconstructing. I'll give an example because people might be like, well, what the hell do you mean? What do you mean by that, Andrew? So for example, because of how we just kind of defined deconstruction. So say somebody, okay, so you leave evangelicalism. I'll just give the extreme opposite end of the spectrum example. You leave evangelicalism and now you are an ardent atheist who, you've deconverted. You are the other end of the ideological spectrum, but you're just as unwavering and fundamentalist in your beliefs as you ever were.
Yeah.
The beliefs have changed, but it's like, it was just an intellectual change.
Yes.
Like, you're not holding anything with any more lightness. You're not holding anything or approaching anything with any more curiosity or openness. It's still a brand of fundamentalism. It's just the aesthetic has changed. Would be how I would describe that.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at that. I know we'll talk about that a little bit later, more in depth too, that idea of being just as fundamentalist, but with different beliefs, But yeah, I think that deconversion process, maybe sometimes it's harder for people. If you've been if you were born into a faith system or grew up in a faith system, there's often not like a very overt, like I converted to the faith. Whereas sometimes people, like as adults, you can convert to a different religion where you take their membership classes and do these things where it seems like there's maybe a pivotal moment where then you become whatever that religion is. It feels like there's maybe more of a choice there too, though, but that's a different conversation for a different day. So I think maybe it's easy then to say it's like deconverting would be saying like that's not how I'm identifying with that group, with that system, with whatever. I think that can still happen, of course, when even if you grow up in the system and, you don't have maybe that conversion moment. It's interesting as I'm talking with even just like taking the language apart, because we have like you convert to the faith, but then I also think of like, converting to like, or having that conversion moment where it's like, in evangelicalism, it's like accepting Jesus into your heart. That's my moment of conversion where I'm like converting from this secular sinner to, this like holy Christian following God, whatever. And so then deconversion can feel like, no, I don't know. It almost feels really heavy. Like, no, like I'm going back into the secular sinner world or, whatever. I think it feels like a much stronger word or stronger concept to say like, I'm deconverted. I don't know. Do you get that sense? Maybe that's just my own thing.
No, I do get that. It's interesting, and as you say that, something comes to mind, and I don't know if this is exactly what you were getting at or if this resonates, but one thing I hear from a lot of folks who, for whatever reason, were once perhaps very devout and then find themselves on the outside looking in is I really feel like 99% of us who took that journey didn't do it on purpose.
Yes.
Like we didn't because deconversion is kind of a heavy term, and it sounds like there's some intention of like, I set out to undermine fundamentals of my faith.
Yeah.
Like, I never did. In fact, quite the opposite. Very much the opposite. But yeah, to be have intellectual integrity and just follow what I was seeing to be true. It's like, I kind of ended up there kind of against my will. I mean, I'm glad I ended up where I ended up now, but like at the time, like, I'm like, this was not what I was trying to do.
Well, I know we have another concept of Dechurched, but this almost kind of leads into, maybe we'll come back to Dechurched for a second, because I too am similar. Maybe we can talk about some of our personal experiences with like deconstruction, deconversion, because I know there was a long time for me where I really, really wanted to hold on still to like the title of Christian. Yes. I was willing to give up like certain parts of like, oh, I'm not legalistic. I'm not, some of these other things, but I really wanted to hold on to the title or the theology or whatever. And it really was very similar to you. Like I was not trying to get to a point of deconversion, but all of a sudden one day I had this moment where I was like, oh, I'm there. Like, this is like everything that I've done, all the questions I've asked, all the things that I've explored, the curiosity, like this has led me to a place where I can no longer call myself this. I no longer believe these things. And it actually would be inaccurate and dishonest to use this title to describe myself, because that is not who I am at all anymore. But so all that to say, like, I guess I'm just kind of curious to know, like, when did you start that kind of like formal process of deconstruction, or was it a formal process of deconstruction kind of in like what led to your own deconversion?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, especially considering that more than half of that process, I didn't even know the term deconstruction. That was
that's true.
Concept. And it was, I think a lot of folks can relate to this, the loss of community, because I hear that a lot. I am not trying to say that I had it worse in that regard, but I will say Adventism is unique because it is so close knit. Like those Adventists, those of you current or former Adventists listening, I'll say the words like Southern, Andrews, Newbold, Loma Linda, and already I can guarantee you know people at all of those places, and I probably know people that know those people. Like, there's the degree of separation within Adventism is just so small that like everybody has mutual people that you know in contacts, and pastors and evangelists and family members that work for the church, and all of that to say, leaving is like there just was no community. It was very isolating, and so I definitely framed my early deconstruction as, I just felt like I was drifting away. I knew I wasn't coming back. I could tell that I'm not coming back. Like there was a point in I think 2014 where I didn't know where I was going and I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I wasn't going back. Like I knew I wasn't going back. I had just started my master's in counseling, which also I had opted to do instead of going to seminary. That was a pivotal point in my life as well. And so, early on, it was very much framed as, that's how my journey of deconstruction really started. I guess really it's hard to really put like a singular point of where it really began. But I think being that history background that I have, like I took some classes from a professor that I really, really loved that was about Islamic archaeology of all things. No, I didn't convert to Islam, but I was just looking into archaeological sources, textual records, just all of these other things that weren't coming at it from a perspective of like Adventist sources where, basically trying to reaffirm why what we believe is indeed true. I was just looking at all these other sources and realizing, for example, the book of Daniel is very pivotal for Seventh-day Adventism. Gotcha. Realizing that there is no way in hell that book was written when tradition says it was. It was written probably 300-400 years after that point in time. And at that point, it became like a house of cards. It's like my academic integrity. I'm like, okay, I can see the evidence that supports this was written when it says if that's true. Kind of pulls the rug out from underneath Adventism and its eschatology, and probably a lot of other denominations' end times beliefs as well. There's more to Adventism than just Daniel, but that is a very pivotal book for a lot of Adventists for its foundational beliefs.
Sure.
And I said, a house of cards. It was a domino effect. Once that one thing got started, it's just like the rest was inevitable.
Yeah. Did you, when you think about how that process went for you of like, the beginning of that, like deconstruction or formal deconstruction, even though we didn't have the language for it, like, do you have then a moment or moments that were more pivotal of saying like, I can no longer call myself the Seventh-day Adventist, or I can no longer call myself a Christian, whatever it was, like those deconversion moments where you're going, my deconstruction has led to such a point where like this is no longer a part of what I would categorize myself as?
Yeah. Trying to think when I would have really felt like that happened, or when I realized that it had happened. It's one of those things where I don't think I knew when it happened, but I suddenly, woke up one day, realized where I was on the road, and like, holy shit. Yeah, I'm not there anymore. And I'm actually okay saying it now. It's funny, when I left the whole thing, Adventism, Christianity, I deconstructed in such a way where I kind of I know I mentioned Daniel and I mentioned Adventism, but I really deconstructed right out of, and deconverted out of Christianity altogether.
Yeah.
I didn't really do it with Adventism specifically. It was not until 2 years ago that I officially asked my membership to be removed from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we can get to that as far as the whole being dechurched and leaving with intention or not, as the case may be. But yeah, it's just one of those things that for me, it was a very, very gradual thing. And I think there was a lot of, from just a psychological, mental health and healing perspective, there was a lot of trauma and a lot of grief work that was actually probably what a lot of that process looked like. I just didn't know I didn't know what the hell it was. I just like, I don't know. I have depression and anxiety. I'm going to therapy. Like that was my framework. And I think, and then one of my therapists just pointed out, he's like, it wasn't religious trauma informed, but also very insightful, because he just simply said, he's like, well, this thing in your life meant a lot to you, and you're trying to come to terms with it's gone. And you're done with it.
It's so heavy.
You haven't been able to like really admit that yet. And that was like a ton of bricks. So I think that was a moment where I'm like, well, and that was 2020, that pivotal year I mentioned. But I hadn't found John Steingard yet, but that was like a couple of months prior, I think. Yeah. So.
Wow. Yeah. Not to like call you out, but like, I can even see the emotion on your face as you're talking. And I think I know this is not what we're talking about today, but I think it just shows like how committed you were, how important this was. Like, this was not a light decision or process that you made. Like it was ridden with grief and angst and just like desperation of like wanting to make it work, and just getting to that point of being like, I can't, like, the pieces no longer fit. And it's like terrifying and devastating all at the same time to get to those points. And to reflect back on it, like it just, because it brings back so much pain, like because you remember it, right? Like you remember how hard it is to lose your entire identity and question everything about your life.
It is. It's a lot. It is. Yeah. And of course, for me, what I'm describing is deconstruction was involved. But also deconversion, and also I did physically, literally leave the church. Yeah. So all of those things happened simultaneously, not simultaneously, but ultimately all three of those processes happened for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Whew, it's hard.
It is.
Yeah. I can resonate with, I think I remember a podcast that I was on years ago had asked about this process, because I think, especially for those of us who grew up very fundamentalist, there is this very like binary or black and white thinking, right? Like you're either all in or you're all out. And I think there's a lot of people that can experience that also with deconstruction or deconversion, where they go, well, there isn't like a halfway point, like I'm either in it or I'm out of it, right? There's no middle space. But I know for me, I, like you, didn't have the language to, of deconstruction or whatever, but I tried so hard to make it work, it's like, okay, well, if I shift this belief, if I give up this, if I do a little bit of that, but not too much of this, whatever. And it's just, I tried so hard to like make it a more progressive or liberal version of what I had grown up in, trying to make God work, like trying to figure out, but one of my pivotal, you had mentioned this too, like being a therapist and going into a business of working with humans, I guess I can't speak for anybody else. Like I quickly realized that like all these boxes that I had put humans in, this is how you act. This is what people are like. This is right. This is wrong. It didn't fit the actual human experience. Like I couldn't look across my office into somebody's eyes with tears streaming down their face and being like, well, you're wrong. You're a sinner. How you were created is wrong because you are, sexually attracted to the same gender. Like when push came to shove, like the person won, like it was like, I had to choose the person sitting in front of me because I believed their experience. And that for me, it could not impact me. Like I had to start taking people's experiences and viewing them for what they are, which really challenged so many of my beliefs. And interestingly enough, my first therapy job, it was my internship, and then I got hired on, was with working with convicted adult and juvenile sex offenders. And that is where I had so many of my beliefs challenged, because I had believed that the sex offenders are these awful human beings with no redemptive qualities. They're animals who are just out to harm everybody. And sure, there are some people like that. But when you sat in the office with them and were able to say, okay, I am not going to justify any of your behaviors, but I am going to seek to understand who you are as a person, it became so much more complex than just, here's these awful things that you did that harmed many, many people. That we have to work on that, but we also have to understand like how we got there. And it's not simply because you're a sinner. Like, and that messed with me. Like it was really hard to navigate that, especially because I worked primarily with juvenile sex offenders who had 98% of them had been the victims of being offended, being like the victim of other offenders. And so it became so complex that I couldn't just take everything that I had learned and say, okay, this is what's right or wrong. It wasn't that easy. And I think that's what slowly kind of started. It was people that got me out the door. And so I always say, I think therapy saved my life, but like not in the way that most people say it, right? Like therapy saved my life as a therapist because I was in the presence of human beings. And I think for me, like I started asking questions, and I had this belief that if God is all sovereign, which means all knowing or omnipotent, then there's no question I can ask or door I can walk through that God's going to be like, well, shit, I didn't see that one coming. And I couldn't walk far enough away that God couldn't get me back. And so I held that as a belief that gave me permission to then ask questions, to start deconstructing. Right. And I eventually got to a point where I was like, I've asked all the questions and I don't need God to be there to pull me back anymore. I think I've asked enough questions, but I do have like a very pivotal moment of like deconversion where, like I said, I had been trying to make things work. And it was what might now seem like a very benign moment. It had to do with the process of trying to purchase a home on my own. And this was before I actually did. This was about 2 or 3 years before I actually did purchase a home. And something about it really clicked with me. And it wasn't going to work. And I got off the phone with my lender. I put my phone down and like audibly, I was living by myself. So there's nobody here to hear this. And I was like, I wasn't supposed to have to do this on my own. And I all of a sudden realized like, oh my gosh, like I'd been holding all these beliefs, like I was supposed to get married and have a family and do all these things and then buy a house. I wasn't supposed to have my own business and, get all these degrees and do this on my own. And I was like, all of the things that I was promised for following these rules didn't happen. And anything that has happened in my life is because I've worked really hard for it. And I was like, okay, so I don't believe this anymore, which sounds so simplified, but it was just like that moment. And like the Taylor Swift song says, like, I was like with God, I was like, we are never, ever getting back together. Like, this is not going to work anymore,
Yeah.
And it was just this pivotal moment. That said, like with the deconstruction process, that's continued, whether it's about religious things, or politics or systems of oppression or dynamics of power and control, economics, finance, like all these things to be deconstructed. But like you, I've been able to kind of depart a little bit from my deconstruction process being mostly focused on religion, and has moved into other areas of life that religion has touched, but isn't maybe necessarily the sole focus of that. So yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to talk about, and so I guess then to that point, because I, like you, also made an intentional choice to walk away from the church. But like, when we talk about that concept of dechurched, I think both of us came into this podcast defining it a little bit different, and both of us are right in terms of like, what does it mean to be dechurched? And really it's like, is it intentional or is it not so intentional? So how would you start that conversation if like, what does it mean to be dechurched?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's just the most basic overarching level. Dechurched would just imply that you once were part of faith body and now you're not, as opposed to the word unchurched, somebody who's never been a part of it, never been a part of that culture, never been a part of that institution. But then like what you just said, the difference that you just defined is like, okay, so you're dechurched now, perhaps. Was that by your intention or not? Meaning, or were you excommunicated or disfellowshipped or what, officially or unofficially? And I know it varies from denomination to denomination, but so actually to that point, because like you said, we did kind of come into this having our own connotations of what that word means, what it implies. What's your experience been with that in terms of like having like excommunication or disfellowshipping, like being threatened or weaponized? How familiar are you with like stuff like that happening?
So, I know everybody is different in terms of like what it was called. I reached out to some of my friends that came out of different high control religions. I know like in the Jehovah's Witness organization, they call it disfellowshipped. And then eventually people are disassociated, right? In Mormonism, it's called excommunicated. I think I probably resonate mostly with that term, excommunication. I don't know in the church that I grew up in that we had like the formal term, but everybody knew what it was. And everybody knew that that there was this like process of church discipline. So like if you were doing something that wasn't in line with the church, like what was that? It was like that passage in the book of Matthew where it's like you go to them privately and then with a group of people and then you cast them out, basically to be left on their own to the devil. And so we were very aware of like what that process was and essentially how terrifying that process was. And I know for myself, I was never formally excommunicated, but I also know I was right on the cusp of that. And I chose to repent of these quote unquote sins that I was committing they actually weren't sinful at all. But it was this idea because I was not in line and obeying the church leadership and the way that they were trying to control me. It was in regard to a relationship. I was on the cusp of getting fired from my job because I was working at the church at the time. And I was very aware that if I got fired from my job, it would be very likely that I would not be able to come back to the church. I knew that that would take away my community. I knew that that would put a huge strain on my familial relationships. I knew that I would not have any friends. And I was at a very large church in a very tiny community. So I also understood that that would impact like my lifestyle, just given that, church members owned different businesses and restaurants and had influence in the community. Like I think about, there was one point where the sheriff, the police chief, and the fire chief all went to our church. And it's like, right? Like, oh, okay. Like this is, I mean, there was much power and influence like in that religious community. And I understood very clearly that if I didn't do something to like, essentially in this sense, I quit my job and then I started this process of repentance. I understood very clearly where that was going. And interestingly, though, when I left that community, that was my own choice. I had a good excuse because I was moving to Nashville, and so it was kind of like, yeah, of course, I'm not going to this church anymore. But I actually stopped going to that church about 3 or 4 months prior to moving, because it was the first time I ever actually listened to my body. And I was like, I get physically ill every time I walk in here. I didn't know what panic attacks were at the time, but I was having them. And so I just said, the best thing I can do is not go. I'll have my own little church or time with God on a Sunday morning by myself. And then when I left church for the last time, which was here in Nashville, over 10 years ago, I left of my own volition. There was no, like punishment. There wasn't anything like that. But at the same time, nobody tried to get me back. Nobody asked what was wrong. Nobody asked why I left. I mean, I had a couple of those coffee dates, but like, other than that, that was kind of my process with becoming dechurched, and also maybe a little bit of like on the cusp of excommunication. Is that something you ever experienced?
Yeah. So firstly, I never did experience that. I was never threatened with it. In Seventh-day Adventism, I believe they would call it disfellowshipping. It does not happen that often.
Oh, okay.
It actually doesn't. And honestly, even within Adventism, I feel like people can kind of bounce, because again, that culture, that tight-knit culture, you can kind of just bounce around to different denominations that suit kind of your flavor, whether more conservative or more liberal. There's actually quite a bit of diversity within Adventism for that. And so I think a lot of folks who in other circumstances might be disfellowshipped or be threatened with it kind of can fly under the radar and do that. And I think a lot of folks do that. I have known a few who were disfellowshipped though. And ironically, it wasn't for becoming like an atheist or a humanist or whatever. It was literally, I think, for becoming even too much of a fundamentalist for even Adventist fundamentalist in the institution, as it were. And so, which is really weird. It's just such a uniquely Adventist thing. Well, anyway, not to go down to too much of a rabbit hole, but like Adventists are already believing, like that we keep the Sabbath and some different things. And there were some folks that also, from the Hebrew scriptures, as we call the Old Testament, a lot of like the feast days basically took to the level of like, not only do we keep Sabbath, we should be keeping all of these as well, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of the old Levitical stuff. And anyway, long story short, they were told to stop teaching what they did. They didn't, and so they were disfellowshipped. Anyway, little Adventist scandal, but I was never threatened with that. Like I said, I kind of was drifting, and I don't think, but like you, similar to what you said, like, when I was no longer there, nobody really reached, nobody actually, no one ever reached out. That includes the senior pastor. That includes a couple of the elders that I had been fairly good friends with. One of them had even known me since I was a freshman in high school. And I went to like the local Adventist academy that was next door to this church, just to give context. Like this guy knew me and he knows me, never reached out. To this day, really, none of them have ever said. I don't know which would be harder, being cast aside by intention or ghosting you like you never existed. I'm not sure which is more painful, but that's been my experience. Disfellowshipping is a thing, but it's not wielded too aggressively within Adventism, I would say.
Did you get pushback when you mentioned earlier that you had like formally asked to kind of like resign your membership within the Adventist church? Was there pushback or a process to that they kind of, like tried to convince you otherwise, or was it pretty smooth?
For me, it was very smooth. Okay. I know that can vary based on the individual pastor that you're dealing with. And for what it's worth, because I've had other Adventists ask me, how do you do that? Get your name off the books. They're like, I've wanted to, but I never have. Literally what you do, you just have to contact the pastor. Email is fine. And just be clear that I would like my name removed from membership, and then specify, I don't want it transferred. I want it removed. Like, make sure they understand I'm not just transferring membership to another Adventist church, because they usually will assume that's what you want to do. Like, okay, well, which church are you changing to? So I did have to specify that. And then he was very gracious. He's like, okay. He didn't pry. He was like, yeah, I respect that. Absolutely. That's your right to do that. He was very gracious about it. I'll give him credit for that. And then, I guess they have to officially vote it through at the next business meeting. And this was still during COVID a couple years ago. And so they were not having business meetings as frequently as they normally would. So it took a year.
Okay. Yeah.
But then finally, the church secretary emailed me confirmation saying that my request had been formally approved and my name was off the books, and that was that.
Yeah.
So.
Wow. Yeah. Isn't that crazy? Like, I feel like we could probably have a whole episode of like how bizarre it is of like the membership piece and like how that is taken in different directions to wield things like power and control. I mean, that's a different conversation for a different day, but yeah, to have to go through that formal process of being removed, that can be a lot.
Yes,
wow.
It can't. Yeah, it really can be. Yeah.
Yeah. So going in a little bit of a different direction, because we've kind of laid out these concepts of like, here's what deconstruction is, here's what, deconversion is, dechurched, and recognizing how they're different. I know one of the things that I come up with a lot, I see this on social media a lot, but also with my clients, is this difference between like deconstruction and healing from religious trauma. And I know we had a whole podcast on religious trauma. It was our very first episode, but I'm just curious, when you have people in your office or in your DMs or whatever, what is the difference between deconstruction and religious trauma? Are they the same thing? Are they different? What would you say?
No, that's a really good question. So like the idea, does deconstructing heal religious trauma in any capacity? The short answer is not necessarily. No, not necessarily. Because so much of what deconstruction is a intellectual and cognitive exercise. And so much of what trauma work is, as we kind of were really discussing it a couple episodes ago, is that it's embodied. It's so much of it is showing up physiologically. It's in the nervous system. It's not in your prefrontal cortex. It's not this rational intellectual framework that you can like kind of play around with. I mean, we talk about it intellectually to put it into to conceptualize it and to put it into framework so we can understand and then access through, a lot of body-based stuff. But I think that learning to hold things in lightness and be curious and sit with and maybe even lean into things that are uncomfortable or have previously been a little bit scary. I do think that serves us very, very well in trauma healing, but I don't think that it is inherently it in itself is not inherently healing trauma.
I agree.
That's the way I would describe it.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. And, I've actually gotten pushback from people when I've said that, like deconstruction is not the same as healing from religious trauma or resolving religious trauma. Cause they're like, well, you're just trying to like dictate my process of healing. And I'm like, no, I'm really not. Because I think what you said there is so important. We're talking about like two different things of like deconstruction primarily being this cognitive process that I really believe is extremely helpful and sometimes even foundational or necessary in resolving religious trauma, like to understand, like, what are these messages that I'm believing and to understand how that they're living in my body. But the actual trauma resolution piece is coming from within your body. And those are two very different processes, even though they oftentimes go together. And I would even venture to say that deconstruction often leads to needing to work through religious trauma. Because I think as we deconstruct, we oftentimes recognize like, oh, wow, I don't cognitively believe these things anymore. But my body is having physiological responses to a variety of different things in my life now. Or we say, gosh, this is so weird. Like I use this example all the time, like within purity culture, where it's like, well, I don't believe that sex before marriage is wrong or sinful. And yet my body is having this physiological responses, either while I'm participating in consensual sexual activity, or maybe, feelings of guilt and shame afterwards. And that's so weird because I don't believe that, but my body's doing this. And so I think that can oftentimes be really confusing, especially when people are like, well, I've already deconstructed that. So, what's going on? It can often lead to a lot of shame. But I think understanding that, these are two very different things. And they definitely can go together and they can like enhance one another, but they are different. And I think it's important to say too, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, like along with that, like, healing from religious trauma, like it doesn't require you to deconvert either. It doesn't require that you deconstruct up to a certain point and then you can be healed from religious trauma. But, is that something like you've seen with clients, or had conversations with of like, well, you have to, I don't know, become an atheist in order to really heal from religious trauma or things like that.
Yes. If you don't love everything Christopher Hitchens ever wrote, then you're not going to heal. No, no, absolutely not. You do not have to. And that's important to say too. I think that, I may be deconstructed, deconverted, all the things, right? Like, and now I am where I am. Do you have to deconvert to heal? No, you don't. The way I would frame it is this, though, especially in context of trauma healing. I will say that if you are still actively holding to an ideology that says you are inherently broken, it's going to be pretty damn difficult.
Yeah.
I'll say it that way, because there are pockets of Christianity that don't push that a total depravity, original sin piece quite as hard as some churches do. I think it's still there in most of them if you really dig deep enough, but I realize there are some churches that don't weaponize it to the same extent. But yeah, I'll say it again. Like, if you are holding to an ideology that says you are inherently broken and flawed, I do think healing is going to be stunted. I think you can still see progress. I would, not to be too cynical, but I would argue, I don't know that you're totally resolving trauma so much as you're just managing symptoms, though. If you're still ultimately believing that you're fucked up, I don't know. I think symptom management is about as good as it's going to get. And I could be wrong, but that's kind of my take on it.
I would probably agree with that. If I was to, talk to any other client, like, let's say I'm not working with a client on religious trauma or whatever, we're working through some other trauma, crisis, grief, like those sorts of things. One of the things that I would be very quick to tell them is that it is very difficult to heal from something that you're still in the middle of, or that you're still in crisis mode from.
Yeah.
And that is certainly not to say that you have to leave church, that you have to deconvert or anything like that. I usually actually would just suggest a break, to say like, hey, if we were to give you some space away from some of these triggers, these constant beliefs, like these sorts of things, that may allow some space for some trauma to be resolved, and then to revisit some of those belief systems to say, hey, what is it that does work for me? What is it that kind of fits like where my values are at? Can I hold a belief in God or these different theological doctrines, beliefs, practices, these sorts of things? I'm very non-prescriptive with my clients. I certainly don't want to. I am not one of those people that is like, yes, you must become an atheist in order to heal from religious trauma. I think that's just as fundamentalist as like, as other religion can be. But I do think that if we are in the midst of the system that is harming us, whether that's a religious system, a cult, a family, a relationship, where we go, there is active harm that's happening that is activating our system and traumatizing us, we really are doing crisis management, symptom management. And so to be able to get to a place where we can feel grounded and safe internally and externally, which oftentimes requires some distance between those environments, and do that healing work, we then can make choices on how we re-enter that, or if we re-enter that, which feels different than just trying to like scrape by with symptom management, essentially.
That resonates a lot. And just the way you described that, like you don't have to leave your faith or leave your church or become a humanist or an atheist or whatever. What it reminds me of is even like in internal family systems with parts work, those who don't have a background of that, I'm not going to totally nerd out, I promise, on this background, but like we help a part to unburden. We don't demand that it let go of its burden, but we give it permission to, and create a safe container where if it wants to, it's safe to do that. And then that's when a lot of work really starts happening in terms of growth and healing and just realizations about things. So it's like, do you have to quit your church or something to effectively heal these things? No, not at all. But also, I want to emphasize like autonomy, you being able to be safe enough to decide if you want to take a step back, you are able and safe to do that. If you don't want to take a step back, okay, that's fine. But you are able and safe to make that choice rather than I'm staying here because I'm too scared to do anything else.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's subtle, but it's, I think, a very, very, very fundamental difference.
Yeah, I very much agree. And maybe along some of those lines, because we're talking about like, what is this weird process of deconstruction, and, is there an end point to it? And, if we, we've talked about this like autonomous process, right? There's no prescription. Here's what you have to do. Here's where you have to land. Like, here's how long it must take. But do you find that, like, if you don't like deconstruct, or if you don't resolve how those messages are actually living in your body, I find that like we end up recreating fundamentalist systems just with different beliefs. And I wonder if we could maybe have a conversation about that, because I know that I think we've had enough conversations on the side to say like, yeah, we're kind of seeing this. And I want to open that up for discussion of this idea of like, deconstruct, so I don't believe these things anymore, but the messages are, and how those messages impact us, are still living in our bodies.
Yeah. Oh, yes. It definitely, that is something very much worth talking about. I think one of the things I mentioned earlier, I mean, this is the most obvious stereotypical example, but that is, someone who maybe was a fundamentalist Christian, ardently outspoken, and becoming an atheist of the same brand of that is, I mean, that's an obvious example, but I do think it does definitely show up, like even like in deconstruction spaces, and understandably so. Like, that's not to knock anybody. It's understandable that that's what would happen. But yeah, I'm curious, trying to think, what is my question here? What are some of the things that you see showing up the most? Like, what I know what I'm trying to ask, but I can't articulate it right now.
I think I know what you're trying to ask, and just, redirect me if needed. But I think some of the things I see is, okay, when we're coming out of these systems, so whether we're talking about religion or cults or other fundamentalist systems, many of us have only been taught what to think. We've never been taught how to think. We've never been taught critical thinking skills. We've never been pointed back to ourselves, our intuition, our own insight, our own bodies, right? It's just, here's this list of rules or doctrines or theologies, and this is what you believe. And it gives us this, at least the illusion of certainty, stability, and safety. You do these things, you get this result, right? Here's the right way to think, believe, act, relate, and these are the wrong ways to do that. And so, when we deconstruct our beliefs, which we've talked about is like a primarily cognitive process, if we just end it there. So, okay, I no longer believe these things, period. And we don't start to address how those things have lived in our bodies, then all we have is this fundamentalist way of thinking that we then carry into other parts of life and relationships. And so that's where we might start to see, latching onto, say, like different practices or groups or ways of thinkings or ideologies that have just as much fundamentalist dynamics. It's just a different message. And so we start evangelizing for those groups and systems with the same vehemence and passion and volume as we did inside our religion. And so we see this a lot with like people that will come out of, these fundamentalist spaces, fundamentalist religious spaces, and then they become, advocates for different things like political parties or social justice causes or wellness cultures or whatever. And they say, this is the way to think. This is the way to believe. And if you don't do it, you're not truly deconstructed. You're not truly a part of our group. And I think that appeals to people coming out of high control religious spaces because it offers the same sense of illusion of certainty and stability and safety, but it doesn't employ any of those other things that we didn't have in religion either. So it doesn't employ critical thinking. It doesn't employ embodiment, autonomy, authenticity, things like that, because it's all about following this different set of rules to get this different kind of outcome in order to be safe in this world. Is that kind of what you were trying to get at? Or
yeah. No, that absolutely answers a lot. And I think that also just made me think it's understandable that folks want certainty, I mean,
oh my gosh. Yes.
So literally what the function of this is, it gives safety, it belonging. It's funny. The thing that you said earlier a few minutes ago about the buying the house and how you were like, I wasn't supposed to have to do this.
Yeah.
Oh shit. That resonated just now thinking of folks who you leave maybe a high control religion.
Yeah.
And the idea that, like you want to look to folks like, well, how do you deconstruct? How do I get through this process? You're looking for prescriptive advice because it is scary. Your whole world is in upheaval. It's understandable that it's scary and it's disorienting. And so you are going to look to folks who maybe have been in it longer, and people who really give a really firm prescriptive, like, this is how you do it. And this is how I understand that people are drawn to that. When you're still kind of in that initial shock and denial, grieving process of the rug's just been pulled out from under you, maybe, perhaps. I understand that it's not a comforting thing for someone to tell you that it doesn't matter, or it looks different for everybody, or it's like, what do I need to do? Like, whatever you want to do. Like, they're like, that's not what I want to hear. I need answers. I need something more concrete than that. I don't remember who said this, but talking about like paths, like to know the way to go, like it might've been some spiritual teacher, and I really don't remember. I'm not trying to co-opt anybody's words, but something to the effect of, like, there is not a path to find. You find it by creating it yourself. But I also remember, like, had I heard that 5 years ago, that would have put me into a tailspin. Like, well, fuck, like, I don't know what the hell to do with myself or where to go, or that's scary.
Yeah. I remember when I left, or when I graduated from high school, and this is dating me a little bit because Josh Harris's book had just come out, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. And I hated it. Absolutely hated it. I thought it was the worst book ever because it sounded so unromantic. And I'm an Enneagram 4. I love the passion and the romance and whatever. And I was like, oh, this feels cold. This feels sterile. This feels so prescriptive. I didn't like it. But as an adolescent, because I was, 17 at the time, who's out in this big world all by myself and having to figure it out, what he was talking about gave me something to stand on. It gave me a sense of certainty. It gave me rules to follow with a promised reward that was like, okay, if I can just do this thing, then I can have these other things. And I will know that I'm good and safe and on the right path, and all these things that help me feel certain and stable in this very chaotic world. And that appeals to our humanity. It appeals to our nervous system for safety, right? And so I look, like, I often compare that and be like, wow, like, in some ways, I am really proud of myself for figuring out that life felt really, really unstable. I felt like I was swimming in an ocean with waves that were like trying to capsize me all the time. And this gave me like a life raft or a like a buoy to hold on to that would help me navigate whatever the storm of life was. And so I think that is why fundamentalism can appeal to people, whether it is inside of a religious context or it can appeal to outside of a religious context, because we go, here is my lifeline. I can hold on to this buoy. So I eat these things and I don't eat these things and I exercise this many times a day and I believe this and I listen to this person and whatever. And that is this buoy in this like really, really chaotic world. And so I want to just say, like, that's incredibly brilliant that you know intrinsically how to do that. And yet, we also need to develop skills to learn how to slowly let go of that and weather life and storms in different ways. And that is part of what deconstruction and healing from religious trauma is learning, like, oh, maybe if there isn't even a storm, but maybe there's other resources that I have that I could develop. And that allows me the actual freedom that I'm looking for rather than just transferring from one buoy to the next. And I think that's why it can be so appealing, even coming out of a fundamentalist system where you're like, I just want freedom. But then we hop into, I call it fundamentalist hopping, hopping into another system. And I think it's because it gives us that buoy to like hold on to when it feels like everything around us is sinking. And it gives us some sense of stability. And that is a very human need. And so I never, ever want to like shame or guilt anybody for doing that, essentially keeping yourself alive, because as we've been talking about, this process is filled with grief and uncertainty, loss of identity, and those are no small things. And so I think it's just important to kind of recognize the nature and the naturalness of that process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that just so perfectly illustrates why trauma work is so important. Like, it's not synonymous with deconstruction necessarily, but it's such an integral piece to this just bigger picture, because like what you're describing, like with fundamentalist hopping, it's like one thing that's remained consistent is that you're outsourcing, outsourcing your security. Like, the locus of control is outside of yourself, because when left to your own devices, you don't actually have internal safety. You don't know how to find what that even means, perhaps. Maybe you've never known what that means, perhaps, especially if you've grown up in staunchly fundamentalist environments. So yeah, I mean, just to tie it all back into just religious trauma, but trauma healing. I think that's so incredibly important. And I think that is a huge piece, and not just perpetuating these cycles of fundamentalism that we see,
So I wonder, as we maybe start to wrap some of this up, when we think about practices, resources, areas of support, that either helped you or things that you use with clients, what are some of the things that come to mind when you think about, these processes of deconstruction, deconverting, becoming dechurched, whether that's by your own intention or, excommunication, disfellowship, those sorts of things. What are some of your go-to kind of resources and supportive factors there?
Well, in terms of books, I will always recommend this book, and that is No Bad Parts by Dr. Richard Schwartz, just because it's a very, very, very accessible book on parts work. In a way, at viewing yourself in a way where, you're not broken, you're not bad. It makes perfect sense why you have shown up in the ways that you've shown up. Like you were saying, not to shame folks, even if they have been going from one fundamentalism to another. Like, it's okay. It makes sense. I understand why you would do that. Totally. But beyond books, in terms of resources that have helped me, honestly, social media, and specifically Instagram. Like I said, I think I saw it posted on Facebook about John Steingard. This was 30-something years ago. But then it was through that I then got linked over to Instagram, started looking at a bunch of the different hashtags like deconstruction, evangelicals, religious trauma. Those are the three big ones that I recall. And that's how I honestly found so many folks that are now part of my community. I mean, honestly, that's how I found you. That's how I found Brian Peck, the Religious Trauma Institute, several other major podcasts that have been meaningful to me through the years. And considering how community is such a thing that folks lose. A loss that we feel after having left a high control religion. I mean, I know social media in person it is more fun and more rewarding in certain ways, but I don't know. Don't knock social media, especially in the era of COVID. That's what we had. That's what I had in 2020. And so it's been amazingly beneficial for me.
Yeah, I can piggyback off of that in the sense, I think I mentioned this before, whenever I started this process of deconstruction, it was very much before social media was a thing. I mean, I think we had Facebook, but we're talking like 2005, 2007, right?
MySpace.
Yeah. I know. I should look that up, see what I put on there. But this just, and even though we had Facebook, it was not social media as we know it today. And so there really was that piece, that isolation piece that I felt. I truly, not in a narcissistic way or selfish way, I thought I was maybe the only person who was dealing with this because there were no other resources. And so that actually caused a lot of shame, oh, what's wrong with me? Right? If I'm the only person dealing with this, there must be something wrong with me that's really not that bad. So I think the community piece that social media can provide, it's huge, because I do believe we heal in relationships. And so to know that we can search a hashtag and find information, and other people who are talking about this can be so helpful. And given that deconstruction is primarily a cognitive process, I think the resources on social media can be very helpful. What I would always encourage people to say or to do is, to try to get into that embodiment piece as soon as possible, even as it pertains to deconstruction. So noticing gosh, am I gravitating towards the loudest voice in the room? What is it that's appealing to me about people who are saying, here is the path to deconstruction, or here's what you must deconstruct? Is that maybe revving up my nervous system, but then like calming it down? Do I feel resistant towards that? What if I'm embracing it? Can I be curious as to why I'm drawn to that loud voice or that prescriptive voice? And what would happen if I didn't just take them at face value, but I employed curiosity or I employed critical thinking? And so I think the more that we can allow ourselves to dip into those parts of us that have inherent wisdom, that have the ability to, be brave and consider alternatives, I think that can be really, really helpful and not easy. It certainly is not easy. But I think that also starts down the path of healing from religious trauma as well, if that is your experience, or at least just healing from the impact of high control religion and how those messages live within us. I wish there was like a book, better like, oh, here's some resources. But then part of me is like, I'm also glad that there's not a book on like how to deconstruct, because that also feels like very, very prescriptive. I do know, and full disclosure, I have not like read the entire thing, but there's a book by David Richo, I think is how you pronounce his name, Richo, called How to Be an Adult. And I know there's a lot of people in post-religious spaces that have felt very encouraged by what his work is. And part of it is because it really is a turning back to self, of going, how do I understand what is valuable to me and how to navigate through this world? So I would highly recommend that as a resource. I love the book, No Bad Parts. Oh my gosh, it's so great. And if you get it on audiobook, the author, Dechurched, leads you through several like parts meditations. And there's something about his voice that is very just like soothing and kind of like gets you into those, kind of spaces.
I didn't know he read the book, the audio.
Yeah.
book.
Yeah.
I sat through some of his seminars. Like I know his voice. Like I didn't know he read the book. That's great.
I accidentally purchased the book 3 times. And one of them happened to be on Audible. So I would like read the book. And then when it was time for like the self meditations, I'd go to Audible and listen to him do that. And I love the book, No Bad Parts as well. I think it can be super duper helpful, and also, if I can just offer a warning, like be very wary of anybody who is prescriptive, like if they're like, here's the deconstruction school, here's the deconstruction certificate, here's the 10 keys to deconstruction, like I would just invite anybody to be cautious. Pause. I know how much that can appeal to our desire for certainty, including that path of like, how do I do this? But that oftentimes leads us towards being under the care of a different type of pastor that maybe isn't entirely appropriate. So I would just love to offer that word of caution that anybody who is offering absolutes of this is how you do it, this is the path, this is where you must end up, this is what you must deconstruct, to just give yourself a moment to pause and notice if maybe that's how that sits within you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Any language that is prescriptive and telling you this is how you do it. Another term that comes to my mind, and this is not to knock the term. If it works for you, cool. But folks will say it's fine if you deconstruct, but make sure that you reconstruct. And it's like if the term reconstruction has some meaning for you and that works, then run with it. It's not to say that that's not a good term, but to say that you need to do this for it to be appropriate deconstruction that's already a red flag. You're allowed to be unique, and your journey is allowed to be your own, whatever that looks like.
The reconstruction piece.
I know.
Course,
it's such a common word. I see it so much, and I completely forgot about it. But
yeah, because that can be just as prescriptive, right? If you deconstruct, so long as I've heard like big name pastors be like, it's just fine to deconstruct, so long as you don't, like leave Jesus, or, so long as you reconstruct back to Jesus, and again, this is, we all have different paths. We all have different places that we're going to land. And so you get to choose what that is for you. that might lead towards becoming a part of a faith community or spiritual practices, or might lead you out of those spaces. And I think it's all of that is so wonderful. And I celebrate anybody who can identify for themselves what it is that is important to me and live from that space, because I don't want to prescribe that for you. Oh, that's gross, you know?
Whatever your life ends up looking like me as a practitioner, or even as a professional, I wouldn't even tell a client, well, this is maybe something you should do. No, I really, my goal is to help you return to a place of safety and personal autonomy, where whatever you do, it's because you are choosing it. Yes. You are wanting this. You are curious about this, as opposed to doing something because you feel like I ought to do this, or this is what someone else is telling me is the right way to do it.
Yeah.
And you're allowed to make mistakes. If you start down a path and you're like, shit, actually, I don't think this is what I like. That's okay. Change trajectory. You can do that as many times as you need to. That's the other piece. The idea, like this perfectionistic idea that, like, oh shit, I messed up. I started maybe going down a direction and now I'm realizing that's not what I want. Like, well, that really is totally okay. You get to choose and change your mind. That's the cool thing about being able to be creative and hold things in lightness. But personal autonomy, I think, is the big piece that I would always just try to encourage folks, which, that means I can't give you the answers. You have the answers.
What a perfect way to end this conversation. I'm really appreciative of you, Andrew, for all of the insight that you've shared, and just being able to have a different type of deconstruction conversation. Because I know, like, that's one of our focuses of the podcast, is to really be able to, like, talk about religious trauma. And yet we also recognize that we can't neglect this one piece. We're not going to focus on it entirely, but I think to be able to have a conversation in such a way where we're talking about it in a different way can be really helpful, and helps people be able to understand why it's important without overemphasizing it and making it like the thing that, or the only thing to focus on. So I'm really grateful for this conversation, and I look forward to our next conversations as well.
Yeah, so me too. It's been great. Thank you.
Yeah.